back, some of the students, came up with this request, that is to start a series of lectures. So I thought I would start giving lectures on Wednesdays, because most of you are teachers and you have to go to your respective colleges regarding admission, or you are actively engaged in the online admission process. So I thought I would reserve this lecture to Monday initially, but later I decided against that, and I thought I would give these lectures on Wednesdays and Wednesday afternoons between 3 and 4:30. So this will go on for the next 10 weeks on every Wednesday. And remember, the topic will be a choice of mine. I will choose the topic. Of course, these topics are related to literature, and these topics are not the usual ones, like you have, for instance, postmodernism or feminism or ego-criticism or post-humanism or marginalization or subaltern studies. I think we have had an overdose of all this. So I thought I would give lectures on things related to literature, but which would be of some help to us to revive our memory. So I thought I would start with the comic imagination, because very often we focus our attention on tragedies and we focus our attention on tragic elements in literature, but we don't pay special attention to the comedic element, the ludic element, or what we call the ridiculous ones. Say, tragedies are regarded as something very, very sublime. As someone puts it, it's all about warrior virtues. It is all about nobility. It is all about pride, honor, dignity, personal dignity, or resoluteness, or courage. So if you happen to read tragedies, you will come across these elements. But comedy is regarded as something insignificant and something not on par with the tragedy. So we choose to ignore the comedic elements. But today, we live in a world where we try to get some kind of relief from our tragic lives by making our life filled with laughter. So laughter is regarded as something insignificant, and in literature, say we'll start with Nietzsche's definition. Nietzsche says famously that suffering humans were forced to invent laughter. All humans are under a kind of a condemnation, namely to lead a tragic life. So how to find a reprieve from this tragic life? So how to find relief from this tragic life? You have to necessarily invent laughter. So according to Nietzsche, humans were forced to invent laughter, and we were compelled to invent laughter, and people choose to act stupidly and oddly, and usually their actions border on hypocrisy or what we call folly. So it is hypocrisy that makes us laugh, the hypocrisy in others, the folly or stupidity of others, or even our own folly, our own stupidity. So all these forces to have a good laugh at the end. So the commonplace and the quotidian, they become very significant. So when you say commonplace, very ordinary things, the quotidian stuff. And we give importance to this quotidian stuff. See, today, look at yourself. We keep on trolling others on our mobile phones. When we get into social media, the only good thing that we do is to troll others. We send memes or what we call smileys and we give comments. Somehow or other, we expect a few guffaws or laughter at the end. Now, why do we do that? We want to escape from the tragic spirit that slowly envelops our life. See, someone puts it this way: a human being has to strive hard against a few things. He has to fight against a few things, namely ignorance. And as long as you find yourself to be ignorant and you are in pursuit of knowledge, you feel there is something lacking, there is something inadequate in you. As a result, what happens? You have this anxiety that builds within you. I'll come back to this anxiety a little later. But anxiety, according to Freud, is produced and it causes moments which we can only term as anxious moments. So somehow or other, we try to seek refuge in comedy. Okay, so I will add a few more things. We have to fight against ignorance. We live in a knowledge society. We have to fight against poverty because we have to, all humans are condemned to labor. If you do not labor, you are not going to make money. You are not going to ward off poverty. So your fight against poverty also goes on. Your fight against ignorance, your fight against poverty, your fight against disease, and finally your fight against death. That also goes on. So now, how do you find relief from all this? How do you find a reprieve from all this? Only by turning towards things that are common. So now our ordinary lives are filled with such a tragic spirit, and we seek refuge in laughter. We want to make use of laughter as an anodyne to reduce our anxious spirit, to reduce our tragic feeling, and so on. Okay, so having said that, I'll go on to say, what are the things we laugh at? We laugh at others, we laugh at ourselves, and we laugh at the world in general. So we have invented this laughter, and we use this laughter to demonstrate to the world that somehow or other our happiness is linked to laughter. But remember, only as Mark Twain says, the source of laughter is not joy, but it is sorrow. Mark Twain, it is very clear, the source of laughter is not joy, but it is sorrow. Right, even Thiruvalluvar says that, Idukkan Varungal Naduga. So, when we are in such a state of mind, so when we are in the midst of sadness, when we are in the midst of hopelessness, when we are in the midst of such tragic feelings, we try to use laughter to lessen our pain. Now, the pain is somewhere there in our mind. Now, let me continue. So, then we look at people and we have developed a kind of a crass cynicism. See, when we laugh at others or when we laugh at ourselves, often from a state of cynicism we laugh. Now, cynicism is something that comes to occupy our mind because we are tired of the world or we are tired of the ways of the world, and we become extremely cynical and we use this crass cynicism to produce laughter. And remember, anything that produces laughter could be simply ludic or even farcical, or sometimes we become, to use this term, daft or even droll. Say, if you happen to read stories, certain stories, droll stories, we say. Right, I'll explain those stories in the course of my discussion. But remember, um, tragedy glorifies the pathos and the language is sublime, whereas comedy elevates our mood and the language is not certainly sublime. It is a language that borders on sometimes profanity and it borders on irreverence. So the language of comedy is different and the language of tragedy is also different. And with this few things, we'll go back and explore the history of the development of comedy. Okay, so now look at that. The ancient Greeks, they had their own orgiastic rituals. So in ancient Athens, they used to have open air theaters. So in these open air theaters, they enacted what we call trilogies. Now trilogies, that was the term used to refer to tragedies. And after the enactment of these trilogies, it was followed by a burlesque or what we call a burlesque of Greek myth and a satire drama. Usually the order is the trilogies, a satire drama followed by burlesque or what we term a comedy. So let me give you this example. For instance, when Aristophanes, say Aristophanes was the earliest of the comedians. So when Aristophanes wrote his Lysistras, Lysistras, kindly forgive me, I'm not good at producing PowerPoints. I mostly rely on my memory and a few notes that are right in front of me. And I feel easier to talk in a freewheeling manner than seeking the help of a PowerPoint. So kindly bear with me. Right. So now this Lysistras is full of wit. When Aristophanes wrote this Lysistras, and look at this, it is known for its verbal brilliance and unsparing mockery. See, mockery, you try to mock at others, their way of life, their pretensions, the immediate world, and the grossness or the commonness of our ordinary lives. So now they become the center point in a comedy and it produces a lot of laughter. So in such Greek dramas, you have certain stock characters. For instance, you have a character like Alazon, Alazon. And Alazon is an imposter, one who pretends to be what he is not. And, and always a braggart. He brags about himself. He brags about his achievements or non-achievements. He brags about his possessions or even non-possessions. So a braggart, whom we call an alazon. Whereas on the other hand, an iron, E-I-R-O-N, who is an iron? An iron is a self-deprecatory character, one who laughs at his own expense. He laughs at his own expense. He talks about himself and he has a good laugh at himself. And when I laugh at myself, I become the butt of all my jokes. So the joke is on me. Literally, the joke is on me. I laugh at my own expense. And he is an iron. Then you have a character called Bomologos. B-O-M-O-L-O-C-H-O-S. Now, who is Bomologos? He is a buffoon. Unlike an iron and an alazon, he is a buffoon. His mere presence and his comic acts produces laughter. And that too, it produces a raucous laughter, someone who is there. And his very physical presence produces laughter. So the presence of these stock characters, alazon, iron, Monologues, they produce laughter. So now the ancient Greek drama had such characters on stage. Okay, then came a new comedy or Greek new comedy promoted by men like Menander, 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 Philemon, and Diphilus. So Menander, Philemon, and Diphilus. Remember, Menander, he wrote more than 100 plays, but all these plays are not available except for only one play. This was discovered in the year 1957 by Egyptian archaeologists, and the play is titled Curmudgeon, Curmudgeon. And this is an interesting play by Menander, and they call Menander, Philemon, and Diphilus. They constitute what we call Greek New Comedy. And Menander was a great influence on the writers who followed him. So, especially his influence was tremendous on two Roman writers. Remember, Menander was a Greek, and his influence on Plautus and Terence. Plautus, Plautus and Terence. So now Plautus and Terence, they added songs, dances, puns, and even wordplay. So they produced laughter, the songs, the puns, and such things. And they added one more character. This time, this top character is a braggart soldier. He is called Miles Gloriosus. M-I-L-E-S, Miles Gloriosus, Gloriosus, Miles Gloriosus. And you can find a Miles Gloriosus in Falstaff, in Henry IV, Part 1, who is a braggart, who is a fool, and who keeps on talking about himself, right? Miles Gloriosus. So then his plays range from, that is Plautus plays, they range from mythological parody and to burlesque and so on. And absolutely refined comedy. I'll talk about various types of comedy and the language of comedy and so on. Now, listen to this. Terence, who also lived during the same time, that was between 166 BC to 160 BC, he wrote nearly 16 plays, and they were original Greek dramas. And some of the titles of the plays, they themselves sound very comical. And in all these plays, you find mistaken identity. Say, later, Shakespeare borrowed this model from Terence, Plautus and Terence, and very often it is mistaken identity or recognition, and there are also double plots. So Plautus and Terence, they were a great influence on Shakespeare and others who followed them. Now, look at this, commenting on the comic, Plato has this to say. We know Plato prohibited poets from his Republic. He says, never ever allow a poet to enter into a city, because a poet produces nothing but lies. He lives in a world of imagination where there is no rationality. And if you are going to permit someone from such a world, he will destroy the rational self-control of people. Now, he has something similar to say about comedy. Now, he says, comedy is an emotion that overrides rational self-control. It is an emotion. See? Now, when you are in the grip of rational self-control, you don't exactly smile. You don't exactly laugh. You keep a stiff upper letter. So you don't let your guard down, but when you start laughing, you let your guard down. You That shows you are not in control of your rationality. You are not in control of your rational mind. Okay, so now he goes on to say, I will just read a small quote by Plato. Plato says, taken generally, the ridiculous is a certain kind of evil, specifically a vice. Now look at this. Taken generally, the ridiculous is a certain kind of evil and specifically a vice. So, in his republic, there is no place for even writers of comedy. Because a writer, when he writes a comedy, he dilutes the serious purpose of life. Okay, so, and he says people can only laugh because from a state of, or what he calls, a vice of self-ignorance. He calls self-ignorance a vice. Only from such a state, people can laugh. And such people, according to him, think of themselves more virtuous and wealthier than others. Okay, so he advises people not to take delight in evil. If you are going to laugh, if you are going to use this emotion, that simply means you are taking delight in evil. And um, again, he continues to say, I will read out from Plato. He says, no composer of comedy, iambic, or lyric verse shall be permitted to hold any citizen up to laughter by word or gesture with passion or otherwise. So he says, a writer of comedy, he has no right to hold any citizen up to laughter. And Aristotle, to a certain extent, he agrees with Plato. Remember, Aristotle has written about epic and tragedy. He talks about epic and tragedy because both epic and tragedy are serious things. Whereas, according to him, in his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle has written his Nicomachean Ethics, there he says, educated insolence or a jest is forbidden. Educated insolence. Say, when you laugh at others, when you look at someone's ignorance, you laugh at that person's ignorance, and you are from a state of insolence, you laugh at someone's ignorance. Okay, so, and he clearly says, jest is a kind of a mockery, and you should desist from all forms of amusement or jesting. So, one can see in all these observations, the Stoics, say most of the Greeks were Stoics. If you are a Stoic, you are not expected to let your guard down. You are not expected to laugh. You are not expected to smile because you need to have a serious attitude towards life. And when you have this serious attitude towards life, you continue to take life seriously. Okay, so, and according to them, when you laugh, this unrestrained laughter diminished our self-control. Unrestrained laughter always diminish our self-control. So we have to be cautious. Now, this is the stand of ancient Greeks. But the Romans, they had a different conceptualization of comedy. So for them, according to Cicero, for example, he says, the source of comedy is our mental affliction. Say, mental affliction, you are, suppose a human being is abnormal. or subnormal. You may ask me, who is normal? Okay, of course, I'm not normal, and many of us are not normal human beings, because we find it very difficult to define normalcy or normality. But according to the Romans, especially Cicero, the mental affliction is a source of mirth, and it's a prime source of laughter. So is physical affliction. So, to the Romans, the dwarfs, physically deformed people, right, or who were born with the congenital deformities, they were all sources of laughter. So, whenever they had this grand Roman holidays, and they paraded all these people, the dwarfs, the physically stunted people. Now, today we know that it is a sin to laugh at such people, to make fun of such people, to pass crude jokes against such people shows nothing but your inhumanity. So we are aware of that. Now listen carefully. But for the Romans, whenever they had these grand spectacles, there was a parade of such physically deformed people, and they all had a good laughter. Right. So the Romans had a different conceptualization altogether. And in literature, they ushered in what we call a vituperative tradition. Now, what is this vituperative tradition? You go and hit someone below the belt. That is, you flay someone alive. You make fun of someone. And you have this full freedom to attack any human being and make him feel very small, and you can humiliate him by your language. And look at this, this is an extreme form of crudeness, extreme form of rudeness, but the Romans found laughter from this. And there was this man called Varro, V-A-R-R-O, Varro, who wrote what we call this Menippean satires. M-E-N-I-P-P-E-A-N, Menippean satires. Later, this Menippean satire, according to Northrop Frye and others, this was nothing but a banter. Now look at a Menippean satire. It was not crude, as it seemed, but in a Menippean satire, you just laugh at others. Almost, it was a kind of a rib tickling. You know, you become a rib tickler. A rib tickler means it's a gentle way of making fun of others. It's an amiable way of making fun of others. So now look at all this. The Menippean satire introduced by Varro, it is different, but the Juvenalian satire is different. So Juvenal also wrote satires. So satires also made use of language. Irony made use of comic language, because irony is nothing but an understatement. Whereas yes, in a satire, there is a secondary layer of meaning which you have to discover, which you have to find out. Okay, so now the Roman comedies were totally different, and they found so much of joy in laughing at the patricians. See, the Romans had two distinct classes, the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians belonged to the ruling class, and the plebeians belonged to the working class and the soldier class, and so on. So the authority shown by the patricians, the public and private behavior of the wealthy, they all became material for writing such impressive satires. Okay, so now look at all this. The bitter irony which they used in sharp contrast to the gentle ridicule of the Varronian or Menippean satire, and the bitter irony that you find in Juvenalian satire. These were the earliest forms of comic writing. So they all displayed a rich comic imagination, and the Romans produced an exclusive genre, namely satire. So, unlike the comedies, the dramas or plays, they had this exclusive one, namely satire. And the credit goes to a man by name Lucilius, Lucillus, Lucilius. And he has written nearly 1,300 satirical verses. And these satirical verses are exceptionally frank about the contemporary events and people. So, and today the fragments are available. They are available in the form of anecdotes, dialogues, and fables. But the arrival of Christianity um, did not augur well for such comedic writing. And this did not portend well for laughter, because nowhere in the Bible it is said that God laughed, except in one place. And that is in Psalms 2, verses 4 or 5. God will look at people with laughter and scorn. That is, people who do not obey, people who are disobedient. God will look down upon them with laughter and scorn. That's the only time the word laughter is used in the Bible. And when it refers to Jesus Christ, it says Jesus wept. Nowhere in the Bible it is mentioned that Jesus smiled or Jesus laughed. So, for many Christians, to lead a sober life is next to godliness. So, the early Christians, they frowned upon laughter, and they dismissed laughter as sin, and it is unbecoming for a Christian to laugh. Okay, so when they lay down the code for Christian way of living, for instance, Basil the Great, he was an abbot, and he had a long set of rules. And in this long set of rules, Basil the Great says, raucous and uncontrollable laughter results in the shaking of the body. Sometimes it's belly laughter, right? Guffaws. So these are not expected of a good Christian. Okay, so he cites a certain example from the Bible, saying there was a prophet called Prophet Elijah. And Prophet Elijah, he laughed at the worshippers of Baal. And some of the prophets are worshippers of another deity called Baal. And he put them down to death. And that was the only occasion a prophet laughed. And there was another occasion, there was a reference to one prophet by name Elisha, and this man was a bald man, all right, and a egghead. Okay, so there were nearly 42 children. I think 42 children, yeah. And these 42 children paid a heavy price. Prophet Elisha, he condemned them. As a result, he cursed them, and 2 she-bears, they came and tore 42 children to pieces. Now, this is a story from the Bible. For laughing at someone, you pay a big price. And especially when you laugh at a person who has no hair on his head, you are going to pay a huge price. Okay, so that is the price paid by 42 children. They lost their life. Okay, and Basil the Great, he cites this and he says, laughter robs you of self-dignity and you cease to be a well-regulated soul. Okay, laughter robs you of self-dignity and you cease to be a well-regulated soul. Now that is Basil the Great. Then there was another person, his name was John Chrysostom. Chrysostom, John Chrysostom, and he has this to say: He warned that laughter often gave birth to foul discourse. It starts with laughter, but it ends in foul discourse. So do not ever resort to laughter. It will invariably lead to foul discourse and you will come to grief. Okay. Then there was this man called Saint Benedict, and he also lays down the rules. Now, why am I quoting on all these people? How this had a salutary effect on writers of comedies, right? So, my whole talk is about comic imagination and comedies. I'll continue that. See, Saint Benedict, he had this ladder of humility. He calls this ladder of humility. Ultimately, every human being has to develop a soul that is humble, and humility is nothing but a human being's way of showing before God that he is not an equal to God, he is next only to God, and he accepts his worldly status, especially his mortal status, with such humbleness of spirit. So he talks about the humility ladder, and according to the humility ladder, that is step 10 on the rung is restraint against laughter, and step 11 is a warning against joking. First, you don't laugh, then there is a warning against joking. Okay, fine. And these things were taken seriously by the Puritans. And they closed the theaters in 1642. Why? At that time in England, they had started writing what we call low comedy. It was the beginning of comedy of humors, comedy of characters. So it was low comedy. And as a result, what happened? They closed the theaters, and the theaters were opened only in 1660 and later. So now, but remember, comedy existed, or what we call the profane element. Say sometimes the profane elements are the main sources of comedy. So you go back in time, you have something called fabliau, F-A-B-L-I-A-U. It is nothing but a smutty story, a story full of sexual pranks and sexual intrigues. And such stories proliferated in Italy, in France, as early as 14th century. People thought there was nothing wrong in having a good laugh. I think I had told you the story, especially what we call fabliau, right? You read, I'm not going to tell you any story now, the time is very short. You read Boccaccio's Decameron and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, especially his Reeve's Tale and Miller's Tale. So his Reeve's Tale and Miller's Tale are classical fabliau. Go and read out. It is just sexual prank. Now, you come back to the 16th century. When people like Shakespeare started writing, especially in the 15th and 16th centuries, they were following something like, say for instance, around 15th century or so, in Italy, during the time of Renaissance, 15th and 16th century, they developed an art form called Commedia dell'arte. Okay, Commedia dell'arte. Now, in these comedies, you will invariably find an old man as father, who is termed a pantaloon. Then he has a young daughter, inamorata. She is called inamorata. Then a very clever and intriguing servant. He is called Harlequin. Harlequin, Harlequin. So you have a pantaloon, an old father, a young daughter, a high-spirited daughter, and a very clever servant who is known as Harley Quinn. So, such characters were introduced in plays. Okay, so these plays became very popular. So when Nicholas Woodall wrote Ralph Deutster in 1552, this was the first comedy, a very, very popular comedy, but it was an academic drama. It was enacted only inside a university or in a college or in a grammar school. Okay, so now comedy had a place. It had a place in academics. It had a place in the public life. Okay, so if you go to the second part of the 17th century, you come across comedy of manners, sentimental comedy, anti-sentimental comedy, and so on. For instance, when Sheridan wrote Rivals or The School for Scandal, he introduced a certain type of comedy, namely anti-sentimental comedy. And he also introduced a character like Malaprop in The Rivals. And she would, mispronounce those words, and she would use words in such a manner it would provoke only laughter. But remember, the comedy of manners, which became very popular after the 1660, it produced a kind of a comedy that was based on adultery, foolery, and foppery. Now, adultery, now that was very common, and this story was told with such impunity on stage. See, the Puritans banned these plays, but they made a comeback and they became the chief element. Say, adultery, foolery, your idiocy, your foolery, then foppery, the way you dress. They all became sources of comic. These were the comic elements. They became a strong source to produce laughter on stage. Right? Do you mean to say there was no such comedy before? Shakespeare wrote his comedies. Now, Shakespeare is well remembered for his tragedies today, but he wrote excellent comedies, and most of his comedies were full of double entendre. Now, words that give double meaning, say, which provoked a man like Bishop Thomas Bowdler. Do you remember him? Bishop Thomas Bowdler, he wrote, or rather, he removed the so-called vulgar elements from Shakespeare's works, and he produced a work called Family Shakespeare. And this Family Shakespeare was full of emanations. They were removed. The so-called vulgar elements, vulgar language, it was removed because Shakespeare wanted to appeal to all kinds of audience, including the groundlings, as they were called, people who went to watch Shakespeare's plays. So he had to somehow or other appeal to these groundlings. He had to buy their silence. He had to buy their support. So he introduced all those double entendre and sometimes very crude language. Say, I feel a little awkward to even repeat Shakespeare's verses, but the way, for instance, when he describes Cleopatra, he calls her a cow in June, right? Now, a cow in June, right? Very, very derogatory. Today, someone may take serious offense, but Shakespeare used such a crude language. And look at the Tempest. Look at the very first scene when Gonzalo, when the boatswain and others were there. He says, the ship leaks like an unstanched wench. The language is so crude, so vulgar, right? But Bowdler tried to remove all this so that Shakespeare's plays could be read by women and children. So we have a term in English, we call that Bowdlerize. Bowdlerize means to remove the vulgar. But There is a source for laughter there. So Shakespeare created his clowns. Shakespeare created his fools. But fools combine philosophy and comic language. The fools. And Shakespeare's clowns, we know someone like Mulwell in Shakespeare's plays. I don't have the time to discuss Shakespeare's characters. But remember, it was comedy at its best. So Shakespeare wrote such comedies, Ben Jonson, then the comedy of manners. So all these restoration, dramatists, and there came a division of comedy, which people later called low comedy and high comedy. Okay, so when Thomas Hobbes, when he wrote his famous work, The Leviathan, in 1651, he decries comedy as a sudden glory, where this is called a superiority theory. Suppose I want to establish my superiority over others. Suppose I want to establish that I am superior to others. What do? I resort to a language where I feel superior to others, and human beings in general, they try to compare themselves with others at every opportunity. So I compare myself with other people, then I claim myself to be superior. And this moment when they feel superior to others, when others suffer from misfortune, okay, my enemy suffers from misfortune, and at that moment I feel superior to him because, right, he has met with an accident and he has fallen into debt and there is some tragic loss. So I feel superior to him and I have a good laugh. Now, this is a sudden glory according to Thomas Hobbes. So this is called a superiority theory. And around that time lived another man, his name was René Descartes. Now, René Descartes wrote an important work titled Passions of the Soul. This work is titled Passions of the Soul. And in this he says, there are big 6 emotions according to him. These are big basic emotions. And what are these emotions? I'll just read out. He says they are wonder, love, mild hatred, desire, joy, and sadness. Wonder, love, mild hatred, desire, joy, and sadness. And he says there are 3 emotions, that is joy mingled with hatred, and wonder, they always produce laughter. Wonder and joy mingled with hatred, they always produce laughter. This is according to Descartes. Right, I'm not going to talk about Cartesian dichotomy and things like that. But remember, it has a long thought. Say, I want to present something related to literature, which you may have to hunt in books, right? Say, over a period of time, I have collected certain material. I thought I would share them with you so that you can understand something about comedy, right? I will come to modern times. So, when it comes to the later part of 17th century and the 18th century, it was prose, satirical prose. When Dryden wrote his Macflecknoe for the first time, right, he was making fun of Thomas Shadwell when he wrote his Macflecknoe, a very interesting work. But he was making fun of Shadwell, calling him son of Flecknoe, an Irish versifier. So now look at satire. This is also one form of comedy, one type of comedy. But the others mastered this. When Pope wrote Dunciad, he was following he was following Dryden, but he was making fun of another great Shakespeare scholar by name Louis Tybalt. He wrote his Dunciad. He called him the king of dunces. Uh, Louis Tybalt as the king of dunces. Right. But look at the other man. That was Jonathan Swift. When he wrote his Modest Proposal, A Tale of a Tub, or Battle of the Books, he was having a good laugh. But many people condemned him for his Gulliver Travels, condemned him for being a misanthrope, and they also called him his work lacked humaneness. But he was a man after righteousness. So now he wrote these famous Drapier's letters. I do not know how many of you are aware of these Drapier's letters. Say he gave himself this name, pseudonym Drapier, and he wrote many letters, especially about the debasement of Irish coinage. Say he was socially aware. He was a man of great social consciousness, and he made use of his satire to bring about a social change, and that was Jonathan Swift. But the classic one was by Alexander Pope when he wrote this mock heroic Rape of the Lock. I'm not going to tell you the story. You are already aware of the story. It is all about the cosmetics and a woman losing a lock of her hair. And he wrote such works, very impressive works, and he earned the sobriquet Wasp of Twickenham because he could sting like a wasp, and such was his power over the language. And ultimately, whatever they wrote, they were intended to produce laughter. Okay, right. Now, let me continue. Now, around this time, people had this belief. Say, let me tell you something about Lord Shaftesbury. Right. Now, Lord Shaftesbury, he wrote this interesting essay titled Essay on the Freedom of Wit and Humor. Very impressive essay. Essay on the Freedom of Wit and Humor. It was published about 1709. Say, he gave a theory called relief theory. In this essay, he discusses relief theory. Say, around that time, people believed there were certain spirits called animal spirits within quotes. These animal spirits would accumulate in our body. So, we need to regularly purge these spirits. We need to regularly remove these spirits in order to maintain our balance. So, he says, and somehow or other, the pressure builds within us, and in order to find relief, a good laughter is required. A good laughter helps us to relieve ourselves from this dangerous buildup. So, according to him, this is okay. I think he was the first person to use the word humor. So he tried to replace the word for comedy and satire. He used the word humor, and he used the word humor in the modern sense of funniness, or what we call comicality. And rightly, Lord Shaftesbury is regarded as the father of wit. We call him the father of wit because wit is related to the human faculty of intelligence, inventiveness, and mental acuity, mental sharpness. That is wit. So the language that you produce, of course, it brings about laughter, but it comes from your mental sharpness, not because you have mental illness and your language produces laughter. It comes from intelligence, inventiveness, and mental acuity. Now, this is the position of Lord Shaftesbury, and he proposed this relief theory. We saw the superiority theory. The second one is the relief theory. And the next important person was William Hazlitt, who lived in the beginning of the 19th century, and he wrote Essay on Wit and Humor. Say, Lord Shaftesbury wrote Essay on the Freedom of Wit and Humor, whereas William Hazlitt wrote Essay on Wit and Humor. And this was based on his lectures on English comic writers. Say, he argues humor describes the ludicrous. He uses the word humor, which he borrows from Shaftesbury, and he says it describes the ludicrous, whereas which exposes this humor or ludicrous things. Unless you are not mentally sharp, you are not going to distinguish between the sublime and the ridiculous or the ludicrous. Once you can identify the ludicrous, which can happen only with the aid of wit, and it exposes it, and it compares and contrasts it with other things. Now, this is the position of William Hazlitt, and he talks about what we call incongruity theory. Now, what is incongruous? What produces laughter is nothing but the incongruity. Okay, right. I'll give you a very crude example. Say, suppose you find someone, without, let us say, in loose-fitting clothes. You find someone in outlandish dress, you laugh, right? So why do you laugh when you find someone in such outlandish dress? Because there is some kind of incongruity. It doesn't fit you. So now this is an ordinary example of incongruity. Saying, I may be holding a very top position, but my language is vulgar, crude, crass. Now, that is incongruous. Okay? So, now, incongruity theory that says it produces laughter, incongruity in our everyday language, incongruity in our behavior, and sometimes incongruity in our plain zany behavior or conduct. So now jokes thrive on such incongruity. Okay. The next important person is George Meredith. Now, George Meredith, we know him as a great classical writer. So he wrote on the idea of comedy, on the uses of comic spirit. This is an impressive essay on the idea of comedy and the uses of the comic spirit. This was published sometime in 1877. This is a clear-headed discussion on the civilizing power of comedy. Say, he makes a strong defense of the language of comedy. He says it has a civilizing influence and the civilizing power of the comic spirit. This was George Meredith in his essay on the idea of comedy and the uses of the comic spirit. He says, he talks about thoughtful laughter. Now, what is this thoughtful laughter? It is not ordinary laughter. You think and you break into laughter. It is not that you find something comical, you find something idiotic, stupid. Rather, you give a long thought, then you break into laughter. It is a thoughtful laughter or intellectual laughter. Say, a thoughtful laughter or intellectual laughter, it offers a corrective to unreason and sentimentalism. So, now, a very, very thoughtful laughter. Okay, so now just listen carefully. Um, then came another person, Henry Bergson, and Henry Bergson essay, Laughter, an essay on the meaning of the comic. Now, remember, Henry Bergson, a great philosopher, he wrote a book titled Laughter. I do not know. He wrote something on time. Many of you are aware of this book. He was someone who intellectualized the whole concept of time. But he wrote Laughter, an essay on the meaning of the comic. And here he tries to combine comedy with philosophy. And he tried to yoke philosophy with humor. And he simply says, we are unable to cope with the demands of the society, our life in a society, because there are many things about society which have um, repetitive and disjointed qualities. So he says, calm arises from these repetitive and disjointed qualities, and he says laughter is society's defense against lack of adaptive power. We lack adaptive power. So we resort to laughter. Say, when you look at all these jokes that are circulated on the social media, every day we have a good laugh. We look at them, and now why do we resort to this laughter? Because we lack this adaptive power. Okay. Now you come to the 20th century. In the 20th century, two world wars, brutal wars were fought. Then where do you find the laughter? How can you laugh when you confront a large-scale destruction? Right? We have also learned this truth. It was not only First World War and Second World War which killed many people. Even the Spanish flu of 1919 and 1920, which killed more than 10 million people. That means it killed more number of people than the World War I. Right? So now look at all these events: pestilence, right? Pathogens, wars. It killed a lot of people. Then how about war? Now, why do we how can you laugh? And in the 20th century, say there is a kind of laughter, and this laughter can be called black humor. See, I'll tell you about this humor now. Right. Say this called black humor, which was post-existentialist and post-modernist, and had elements of grotesque, 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 macabre, sick, pornographic, scatological, satirical, or combinations of any of this, which can only be called black humor. Say, it is a kind of a black humor. The primary meaning is sick humor. Then the secondary meaning is a bitter and sardonic humor. A sick humor and a bitter and sardonic humor. So, Henry Breton, many of you are aware of this name, Henry Breton, he brought about an anthology in French titled Anthologie de l'Humour Noir, N-O-I-R. Pardon my French pronunciation. Anthologie de l'Humour Noir. It was published in 1939. So the term humor noir, H-U-M-O-U-R, it came to be associated then and with black humor. So now black humor tried to juxtapose humor with horror. World War I, both the world wars were horror. And the death in Spanish flu was a horror. So, if you could juxtapose these two and laugh, if you can laugh, then it is black humor. It is humor, not right. So, Eugene Ionesco, I'll read out his definition, a small definition by Eugene Ionesco. To become conscious of what is horrifying and to laugh at it is to become master of what is horrifying or master of that which is horrifying. Let me read out. To become conscious of what is horrifying and to laugh at it is to become master of that which is horrifying. You overcome horror through humor. Say, humor is your best defense, a defense mechanism which you have to make use of, and you have to use this humor to offset horror. That is a kind of a laughter. So, when humor and horror are juxtaposed and humor dominates horror, right? When humor dominates horror, it is called absurd humor. When humor dominates horror, it is called absurd humor. When horror dominates humor, it is called grotesque humor. Grotesque. It is called grotesque humor. Okay, so now try to remember humor and horror. I'll explain in the next 15 minutes or so. I'll tell you more about black humor and I will end my talk. Now, before that, there is something called meta humor. This term was coined by Alfred Jarry, A-L-F-R-E-D, Alfred Jarry, J-A-R-R-Y. It is called meta humor. Now, what is a meta humor? It is a humor on humor. It is laughter laughing at itself, laughing at itself, a dianoetic laugh. Now, how can you laugh at a laugh? Right? Say, a meta humor. There is laughter and you laugh at the laughter. Say, whenever you invoke these Vadivelu jokes, you are precisely doing this. You are laughing at the laughing matter. See, now the grotesque humor is something that that resists humor. See, it resists humor. You want to laugh at something and you are resisted by it. And you are trying to convert that material that resists laughter as a laughable material. I'll explain that. But try to remember these two concepts, meta humor on one side and you have on the other side the black humor. Then there was this man, Bruce J. Friedman. Now, Bruce J. Friedman, he coined the term tense comedy. Tense comedy. Comedy that is produced. See, today in the last 3 months or so, whatever you see and laugh, it is a kind of a tense comedy. Because there is a disease out there which threatens us, right? I mean, unless we experience death in close quarters, we are not going to be afraid of that disease. But still, whether it is disease or loss of jobs or loss of income or loss of health, what makes people unhappy, we do not know. But somehow or other, we try to laugh. Now, this is tense comedy. People laughed during the war period. People laughed during the time of war. when bombs were falling all around, when they were without food. So it's a kind of a dense comedy. So we will see that. Now, then there is this person, her name is Erika Ostrovsky. Now, Erika Ostrovsky, she coined the term emetic laughter. Emetic means it makes you throw up. A painful laughter. It comes from your entrails. Say, when you read the work of Kafka, say for instance, you try to smile when you read Kafka, when suddenly Gregor Samsa turns into a beetle, right? And with all those flailing arms and everything, when a human being turns into a beetle, you try to laugh. And that laughter is not a natural laughter. It's someone metamorphoses into a creature, into a beetle. Okay? So now that laughter is an awful laughter, an emetic laughter. Now that is the term used by Erika Ostrovsky. Right. Now look at all these people. They have come up with various terms, and uh, we have terms like black humor. We have terms like um, uh, meta humor, but we are all essentially concerned about laughter. Okay, so I will end here because I've got another 10 minutes time. Comedy became a very serious topic, I know that. Okay, so I'm not good at telling jokes. Some people ask me whether you have comic imagination or whether you are capable of telling jokes. Right, I always tell them comedy in my mouth is no laughing matter. I'm not good at telling jokes. But remember, jokes proliferate and we have stand-up comedians and people tell jokes and they say all kind of jokes and comedy thrives. We have a separate breed of people called stand-up comedians. So one such stand-up comedian was Groucho Marx. I do not know how many of you have heard of Groucho Marx. He was very popular and he in fact made fun of all those writers of the past. See, in literature, we use burlesque, we use satire, we use parody, we use pastiche to make fun of other writers or other writings. But in real life, stand-up comedians, they laugh at politicians, they laugh at, sometimes they are very cautious if you are going to laugh at religion, right? Because it may be considered blasphemy, it may be considered heresy, because we have to draw a line called the ethical line, and we should not be offending others' belief system or way of life. So that may result in um, jail term or they may result in tension among communities. So when we produce comedy, according to the stand-up comedians, it should be in such a manner, a genial comedy. Say, there was this man by name Stuart Dave, S-T-U-A-R-T, Stuart Dave, D-A-V-E. In 1960, he coined a term called amiable humor, A-M-I-A-B-L-E, amiable humor. What is this amiable humor? Without offending anyone, without making someone feel hurt, you can still laugh, right? And we have to develop, and most of these stand-up comedians, they have such comic spirit. Well, for instance, Groucho Marx, he makes fun of Karl Marx. Karl Marx said, religion is the opium of the masses. Religion is the opium of the masses. Whereas Groucho Marx says, not religion, television is the opium of the asses. Okay, now you can call someone a punster, you can twist the word, you can turn the word, and you can produce laughter. So now stand-up comedians, they always set up something and you expect him to say something, but the punchline comes differently and we all break into laughter. Now, look at the jokes. I will start with a couple of things and with a comic note I would like to end my talk. Look at this. This was a beautiful joke. This was popular in the 1950s and 60s. There was a very beautiful girl, and she was leaning against the rail of a ship. The ship was sailing smooth. Then suddenly there was a disturbance. A small but very strong wind blew, and the ship, tilted a bit, and this young woman was thrown overboard. She was about to drown. And suddenly, there was another figure which jumped into the water and rescued the young woman. So, then that person who rescued the young woman turned out to be an octogenarian, a very old man. So, he was the oldest man on board of the ship, and he had rescued her. So all the passengers cried, "Let us have a toast. Let us celebrate the bravery of this old man." So that night, they all celebrated him. A young woman's, beautiful woman's life was saved, and it was saved by a very, very old man. So the old man stood there with a grim face, right, taking in all the appreciation. Then they said, "Speech. You have to give a speech. You have to talk. You rescued a young woman." But the old man kept his face very stern, and he simply said, "Who pushed me?" Right? Who pushed me into the water? Right? Now that ends that. So now you slowly build up a young woman falling into the water and an old man trying to save her. And finally, it turns out the old man himself was not exactly brave. Right? Someone had pushed him into the water. Right? Now, so finally, when he says, "Who pushed me into the water?" Right? There, that is the punchline. So a stand-up comedian can tell you a story. He can milk a story. He can give a wonderful story, right? And when he presents the last line, we all break into laughter. Or now look at this other one. There were three drunkards who were trying to get into a metro station. They were trying to, into a railway station. They were ambling on the platform. The train was about to leave. There were three people. Then suddenly, a porter and a ticket examiner, they managed to push two people into the train. But one fellow was left out. So this fellow was standing glum on the platform. Now the porter tells him, "Look, those two fellows must be feeling sad. Are you not sad that you are not able to get into the train? We can in no way stop the train." Then this fellow says, "That is true, I am very sad. And those two fellows came to see me off. They were my friends, they came to see me off." Okay, now this is a small story. You build up a story. Then in the last one, you say, "Those two fellows came to see me off." Right? Okay, the wrong fellows got into the train, the right fellow was standing on the platform. Right, yeah, you break into laughter. See, there are many things about our life which can be crude, which can be vulgar, and we can laugh at jokes. Sometimes we can also have what we call self-deprecatory jokes, like the one, a fellow who went and joined an organization, and in that organization they asked, "We need a very responsible person." So the fellow went and presented himself during the interview. "Look, I'm really a responsible person." Now, all the interviewers, they were curious. "How do you claim that you are a responsible person?" He said, "I had worked in more than 15 companies in the past 20 years or so. You can refer to them. Whenever things went wrong in all those companies, they told me I was responsible. Whenever things went wrong in all those companies, they told me I was responsible." Now you have a responsible person. Okay, so ordinary everyday conversation, right? Or something as serious as a film like Imsa Yarasane Rutimana Pulikesi. Okay, right, which is a parody. Every sentence is a laugh riot. every sentence is a laugh line. And somehow or other, we feel happy in the presence of laughter, in the sense, laughter is instrumental in producing happiness. We don't laugh because we are happy. We laugh because we are sad. We laugh because we are hopeless. We laugh because there is uncertainty. We laugh, there is fear of future. We laugh because there is so much of anxiety. And somehow or other, we want to find a relief, and laughter provides us with what we call anodyne. It perks up our mood, or it elevates our mood, and we find our mind acquiring balance at the end of the day because we have laughed. Okay, so now it is both. It helps us and it heals us. That's why in the Reader's Digest, they have a regular column called Laughter, the Best Medicine. Laughter, the best medicine. Remember, laughter is prophylactic. It will prevent us from diseases. Once the disease comes, it proves to be therapeutic. It's not only disease. In all our life's situations, in all our life's moments, laughter is either prophylactic or therapeutic. Okay, I stop here. Kindly forgive me for the mess up. There was this, yesterday I sent you a different ID, but when I went and looked for live streaming, that identity got changed. That is why I messed up, and many people could not join, and they were sending me message after message and call after call. I assure you, next Wednesday this will not happen, and we will make sure that everyone enters. Anyway, it is available on YouTube, and you can watch that. It is recorded, and you can watch that. And I hope talks like this, lectures like this will be of some use to us. These are different kinds of lecture, mind you, nothing to do with your prescribed text inside the classroom or any such thing. Okay, you can listen to us, and this is an initiative from the Department of English, National College, and we are happy to continue with these lectures. Please join us, and I will inform you a day early about the topic. And if you like the topic, you can join us. Perhaps we can have a linguistic turn in literary theory, or we can even have literature and paintings. Say, many of the unusual topics which I had given in over the last 10 or 15 years, I had given talks, and most of these lectures are based on my past talks. So I invite you for these lectures. Admission is free, and certainly these lectures are not for certificate hunters. Not for certificate hunters. We are not going to provide you with any certificate for attending these programs. This is for your thinking, right? It is going to be a purely a cerebral exercise. Okay. You attend any number of webinars, you attend any number of lecture programs. I encourage you, especially my young students, I encourage you. But this is our initiative from the Department of English, National College. So every Wednesday for the next 10 weeks, there will be 10 lectures. This is the first one. You can listen to 9 more lectures of this kind. Okay, thank you for your patient listening, and thank you for joining us, and I take leave. Thank you so much. I stop recording now.